Provincial Debating Championships for Ontario. The resolution before the House is this House would have all Canadians pass the citizenship test before they can vote. Representing the government, the Leader of the Government, Tae-Hoo Kim. And Deputy Leader of Government, Anson Kwok. Representing Her Majesty's loyal opposition, as Leader of Opposition, Denizen Euchre. And as Deputy Leader of Opposition, Valentin Lipton. Without any further ado, I would like to call upon the Leader of the Government to speak to the resolution that stands in his name with an 8-minute speech, the first and final minute of which are protected. Hear, hear.
Do I speak from here? Okay. Can everyone hear me? Mr. Speaker, we talk about rights an awful lot. We talk about our right to life. We talk about the freedom of expression. But rarely do we ever discuss our responsibilities. We on this side of the House believe that in order for our rights to be that sovereign exercise of choice, to be that miracle of freedom, we must first uphold our responsibilities as Canadian citizens. And it is under this kind of principle that this House would have all Canadians pass the citizenship test before they can vote. So we're going to give you some definitions, a model, and three constructive arguments. The first being the social contract, the second being identifying values, and the third being an analysis on the contents of the citizenship test brought to you by Anson. So first, let's go through the model. We believe that this should come into effect in 5 years to give everybody ample time. We say that all current voting restrictions will still apply. We will give exemption for living with disabilities, and we will also ask provinces to expand civics education wherever necessary, because really, they should be doing that anyway. So let's go on towards our first constructive argument, the social contract. So we believe that the social contract has something called the principle of reciprocity. It's not actually called that, but I just made it up, but I think it still stands. Basically what it means is that the social contract is the relationship between the government and the people underneath the government. And in order for them to keep the social contract, the government has to ensure their rights, but the citizens also have to give responsibilities. For instance, the citizens have to pay taxes, they have to abide by laws, things like that. Therefore, we believe that on principle, in order for you to have certain rights, in order for you to fully exercise certain rights, or even have the right to have those rights in the first place, you need to first fulfill a responsibility. And we're going to explain why it's such an important responsibility in all of our other argumentation. The first issue that comes up, also under the social contract, is this practical issue of keeping the contract. That is, if you don't understand what your rights entail, if you don't understand what rights you have as a citizen, and if you don't understand the consequences of voting as a citizen, then two things happen. First of all, you're not making the full use of your rights. And we think that's problematic because it's basically really important towards that kind of expression that you know the consequences of voting. But we also think there's a second reason, not at this time, as to why this is actually necessary in order to make it a law, in order to make it mandatory. And that's because of the check and balance of the government's power. We think that a lot of people are overly complacent. We think that my mother voted in the recent Canadian election because they think one man looked more attractive than another. We don't think that's right. We think that people really need to understand the consequences of their vote in order to make fully rational and fully informed decisions as to what they are doing. And if they do not, then that just isn't a check and balance on the government's power. That means that the government currently in power, with the power that they have as a government currently in power, can have a large majority vote already, because people just aren't informed of the consequences of their decisions. Anson will also be talking to this about this later. We also think there's also a principal benefit as to informing citizens of their rights. As citizens don't know their rights, they can break their rights or misuse their rights, and we need protections from that. Because that doesn't just violate one person's rights, that violates the rights of every single Canadian under the Canadian government, because your decision impacts the decisions and impacts the workings of the Canadian government. So we believe that the social contract applies. You had a point about information.
How does a government that doesn't allow certain citizens to vote derive its mandate to govern over those people?
It derives its mandate to govern over those people because those people are They derive their mandate to govern under those people because what they're doing is, government currently rules over immigrants, right? The government currently makes rules that every single person inside Canada has to apply for. So in other words, regardless of what your status is, the government still has laws in which you don't necessarily have those full kind of freedoms. So we think the same principle applies. We think that if you don't qualify for citizenship, you can't have certain rights bestowed to you. And we think that if you don't qualify for another specific level of citizenship, that is after you pass the citizenship test, then these rights also do not apply to you. Which brings us towards our second constructive argument about identifying our values in society. And we first have to understand why is our values important? Why is our identity important? And we can think of several reasons. The first is about historical precedent. That when you make a decision as a voter on changing Canadian values or upholding Canadian values, you're doing it without the context of where those values came from. You're doing it without the context of all the history that Canada has gone through and the importance of certain issues. And therefore, your decision may necessarily harm other people's decisions, and your decision may not necessarily to the full extent express your desires as a citizen that would be if you did understand the full consequences, ramifications of your decision. Because we have to understand that people make decisions in Canada not in a vacuum. We don't make decisions in Canada based on just the last 5 seconds. We have to be aware of our history because Canada has existed longer than us. Every single person in this room, every single person in all of Canada does not still comprise Canada. Canada is what it has been a year before, a decade before, or a century before. And that kind of knowledge has to be that kind of knowledge is necessary to give context towards the issues in which we vote for, on who we vote for, and whether or not we want to change the values that we stand for today. And therefore, by having this test, by having more people incentivized to taking this test, and by having people take this test before they make decisions, what happens is that people are aware of our values, people are aware of our responsibilities and of our values and of our rights, and therefore they can make fully informed decisions, and the recklessness does not harm the others that do know these values. The recklessness does not damage Canadian democracy. Which brings us towards the second subpoint for this argument, as to why is this especially relevant in this instance? Why is this especially relevant in Canada, and why are we passing it in Canada? And that's because Canada has a multicultural identity. It's one of the very few countries that do, and it's one of the very few countries that stood by that for a significant amount of time. So what does that mean? It means that we have different cultures presiding along the same geographic landmass. We have different cultures applying by the same rules and voting for the same issues. And when that happens, we have conflicting values. For instance, certain cultures may not necessarily value women's rights as those of other cultures, or certain cultures may put more emphasis on race than all the rest of Canada is comfortable with. So first of all, we need to be aware of what the status of our Canadian values is now. Do we respect women's rights? Do we respect the rights of minorities? Do we respect the rights of people regardless of their race? And only after we are aware of those values can we do one of two things. One, if we continue to uphold those values, if we continue to listen to politicians that say, I am upholding Canadian values, and not fully aware of what the politician means when he claims this. And the second is debating these values, as in, should these be Canadian values? Should we continue to have these values entrenched in our society? If we simply take our decisions based on a vacuum, if we take our decisions outside of context, then we may not necessarily understand the full ramifications of our decision, and that can lead to irreparable harm towards the path that Canada is going towards. We believe that is harmful and something that must be stopped. And we believe that there is tremendous benefit in giving context to individuals that vote for these issues, that discuss these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, we are citizens. We have rights and responsibilities. We have knowledge and we have power. We have information, and with that information, with that context, with that understanding, comes agency. We are Canadians, and it's high time that we are proud of not just what it means to be a Canadian today, but of what it means to be a Canadian in all of Canadian history. And for those reasons, we urge you to stand for Canada and to stand proud beside proposition.
I thank the Speaker for his comments. Call upon the Leader of Opposition